welcome back to another episode of Swamp Stories. For this episode, we fully cover the entire history of LA's most infamous group of guys. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new. You can also follow the Instagram page as well. Oh, and let me say this will be my last California video for a little while. I love making videos about my state and it's truly my passion. But at the same time, I do want to keep branching out and learning about other states and even other countries. So please hit me up on Instagram with stories and ideas to cover. So let's get into it. In order for this video to make sense, let's head back to the start. The 1950s. At this time, the concept of the streets was yet to be born. It's hard for people to picture, but South Central was once a peaceful area with all kinds of great attributes. Essentially, it was the place where thousands of families from the South came for paradise. They worked hard, purchased homes, and built a new community. It was truly the American dream in California. Now, obviously, life is complex, and I would be exaggerating if I said that everyone was living well. But the numbers show that overall, South Central was a great place to live. It was affordable, the homes were well built, people had lawns, and the kids could freely play in the neighborhood. But sadly, the next decade would be the start of a rapid decline. Historians argue about why things fell apart, and I won't dive into it because that's not my role. But the fact is that in 1960, South Central really took a downward turn. It was an extremely important year in Los Angeles history. That's because it's the year where a small group called the Groovers formed in South Central. They rose from South Hoover Street, which runs from Exposition Park down to Rosecrans Ave. And at first, it wasn't intended to cause serious chaos, at least not to the extent that it ended up doing. It was really just teenagers and young men who wanted an outlet to express their toughness and pride. So the 1960s Hoovers were not really involved in anything too serious. But that would change in 1969. This is the year where the Crips were formed by Raymond Washington. Initially, it stood for Community Resources for Independent People, but in reality, it was hardly that. Well, at first, everything was okay between the Hoovers and Crips. They each had their own areas and generally had respect for each other's side. However, in 1971, all of that would be put to the test. In March of 1971, one of the founding Hoovers lost his life at the hands of a West Side Crip, or at least that's what they thought. Directly after this incident, the Hoovers were understandably furious. But before the Hoovers could do anything, the West Side reached out and called for a conversation. So the next day, the two groups held a meeting at St. Andrew's Rec, right in the heart of the West Side area. Tensions were extremely high because both sides feared that the other was setting them up. So for the first 30 minutes, everyone was closely watching each other's every movement. All it was gonna take was one wrong move and everything would have gotten chaotic. But in the end, everyone came to an agreement that the West Side was not to blame. Instead, both sides blamed it on the Figueroa boys. So in turn, both the Hoovers and West Side turned against them. In fact, after this, the West Side and Hoovers gained a strong alliance. Their territories are right next to each other across Vermont Ave. So this meant that the Hoovers were welcomed on the West Side and vice versa. Well, over the next few years, the Hoovers got so close with the West Side that they themselves became known as the Hoover Crips. So it's the mid-1970s and they happened to be aligned with everyone except the Fig Boys, who quickly evaporated. But sadly, all of this wouldn't last long. In 1979, rumors spread throughout LA that the Hoovers weren't seeing eye to eye with Crip founder Raymond Washington. Some say that he wasn't their biggest fan, but others say that he simply didn't care. But regardless of the reason, the Hoovers had bad feelings towards him. Now mind you, this guy was held to the highest status, to the point where not even a rival would do anything to him. But this is when the Hoovers started to gain their unique reputation as the wildest group in all of California. And that takes us to August 9th, 1979. Raymond Washington is hanging out in front of his childhood home on East 64th and San Pedro. And that's when a sedan with 4 people inside rolls up. The men call over Raymond and he walks down to the car to greet them. And after a few minutes of casual conversation, the men in the car take it to another level. Bang. This was a major deal in LA, like possibly the most important event in South Central history. But sadly, no one would ever go down for it. Either way, LAPD would make some interesting statements. From their knowledge, Raymond Washington would only walk up to a car of people that he knows very well. The bottom line is that he was way too smart to be fooled by a stranger. And they claim that everyone in South Central knew who did it, but no one officially spoke up. Rumors spread that it was the Hoovers who did it, and this was the very start of an incredibly wild reputation. This event pretty much split South Central in half. The Eastside Crips, who Raymond Washington led, called for all the Crips to disown the Hoovers. And honestly, that makes perfect sense. The Hoovers didn't originate as Crips and they took down the founder. So there's no way that anyone loyal to the organization would stick by them, right? Nope, and it's extremely messy. The West Side, also known as 8 Trey, decided to stick by the Hoovers. And after them, so did Main Street. These guys are located just east of the Harbor Freeway and have always been known to get money. So together, the Hoovers, 8 Trey, and Main Street were rock solid. And for a long time after, these guys all remained as solid as can be, and that's because everyone else disowned them. I'm not even exaggerating. Here's the list of the people who made the Hoovers their instant rivals in 1979. First, you have the infamous Rolling 60s, and this may be the biggest rivalry out of all the sides. And next would be the Rolling 40s, 50s, and 100s, who are no joke either. I kid you not, there were dozens and dozens of incidents between the Hoovers and all of these groups individually over the next few years. And this is the era where all hell broke loose in South Central. Before this, issues were dealt with one side versus another, but it did not involve everyone around them. Historically, there were rules and codes of conduct, but all of that was off the table in the 1980s. And this next story exemplifies that perfectly. At first, the Hoovers had problems with all the guys in blue that I mentioned earlier, but there were yet to be any issues with the guys in red. However, in 1984, all of that would change. During this era, the Hoovers were trying to find new groups to have problems with every day. They didn't care who, what, when, and where. They just wanted chaos, plain and simple. October 12th, 1984. It's a Friday night in LA, and that means it's the best day of the week. That's because it's Friday Night Lights, where the football teams face their division rivals. And on this day, the big game is at Crenshaw High School. So that means that all of the teenagers in South Central are there with their crew. The game goes well, and afterwards, a group of 5 Deuce Hoovers head back to their car. They pull off, and as they drive down 54th towards Western, they pass a gray Chevy Tahoe. In front of the car are 4 guys holding up hand signs that they can't decipher. So the Hoover teens make a U-turn and pull right back up to the car. When they pull back up, they notice a famous face. That would be Tyrone Fudge, also known as Ace Capone. This guy is a Van Ness Brim, and his name rings bells throughout South Central despite being just 18 years old. Well, once the Hoovers notice him, they yell, "Hey, there goes Ace." And that's when 2 of them hop out of the car and begin chasing him down Western Ave. While 2 of the Hoovers are chasing him, the other hops in Ace's Chevy and drives it away. Long story short, Ace ends up getting away. But when he returns, he notices that his car is gone. So he panics and runs all around the area looking for his car. And finally, he finds it in the 57th Street alley. He's relieved, so he walks up to the car and notices something strange. 5 Deuce Hoover is spray painted all over his car. And on top of this, all of the speakers are missing and the ignition is gone. Wow, the Hoovers really embarrassed one of the most feared people in all of South Central. So after this, Ace starts asking all around, who are the 5 Deuce Hoovers and where can I find these guys? Well, a lady friend of his lets him know about a Hoover gathering later that night. So Ace gets together with 2 friends and decides to head to the party. 9:30 p.m. Ace and his friends arrive and notice at least 20 people at the barbecue standing in the front yard. And that's when they hop out. Bam! This incident shook up the Hoovers. They didn't know what happened and only the 3 Hoovers from the football game really knew. Well, on November 10th, 1984, Ace would go down and eventually get 95 years. And this kicked off another wild rivalry for the Hoovers. The Hoovers versus Van Ness Brims was as serious as it gets, but it's actually far more complicated than just that, so let me break it down. The Hoovers became way too big to just be one group, so they broke down into 9 different sections, all of them claiming a specific territory. Starting at the very top, you have the 5 Deuce Hoovers, who cover from Vernon down to Slauson. Because of their location, their responsibilities are the rolling 40s, 50s, and 60s. Then directly under them in a small area, you have the 5-9 Hoovers, who have the same rivals as well. Then you have the 7-4 Hoovers, also known as the Beybes, and these guys are extremely close with the 8 Tray Crips. Then you have the 8 Tray Hoovers, and these guys are by far the most active. They're known locally as the Tiny Rascals and nobody likes them. Towards the end of the video you'll see why, they're just too wild. Then you have the 9 Deuce and 9-4 Hoovers, and these guys are heavy rivals with their close neighbors who are the Rolling Hundreds. Then you have the 107 Hoovers, who are known as the second most active set. They rival the Rolling 90s and 100s as well. And lastly you have the 112 Hoovers, also known as the Laylos. This is a small set that isn't really active, but altogether the Hoovers took over the 1980s and 90s. During this time, every single day was a wild one in South Central because of them, and they stood out by wearing orange everything. Orange rags, Converse, jerseys, and most importantly Astros hats. And a unique thing about the Hoovers is that everyone plays a different role. Some people step, some people drive, others get money, and others handle the girls. As long as they contribute to the organization, they don't have to be the biggest and baddest. Well, over the course of the 80s and 90s, they also expanded to other regions. They were so wild and feared in LA that they had the luxury to send other members across the country. Most importantly, hundreds of members started moving up to the Pacific Northwest, specifically Portland and Seattle. Now look, I'll be the first to admit, these are the least intimidating sounding cities in the world. When you hear someone say I'm from Portland or I'm from Seattle, the last thing you think of is, ooh, he survived a rough life. But when the Hoovers moved up there, things started getting hectic. Everything was led by an original Hoover named George Hendricks, also known as OG Peanut. He established the 7-4 Hoovers in South Seattle. And for those of you who are loyal Swamp Stories fans, you'll remember that this is the neighborhood that I called a nice area. And of course, everyone from there went absolutely insane. They legitimately tried to tell me that South Seattle is just like Southside Chicago. I still laugh about that to this day. Like, bro, you're from Seattle, go take your kids to soccer practice. But all jokes aside, between 100 and 200 Hoovers ended up settling down in South Seattle throughout the 80s and 90s. And that was their first expansion and would eventually set a blueprint for the rest of LA. But for now, we head back to LA and we fast forward a couple of decades. Over the 80s and 90s, the Hoovers had a very close ally that they could always trust. That would be Main Street. Both 8-4 and 9-8 are located directly across the Harbor Freeway from the Hoovers. And for a long time, these guys stuck beside each other like glue. And that's what makes the next story so crazy, so let's get into it. Main Street has always been one of the smaller groups in LA, but despite their small size, they always had the most money. And that did make them slightly vulnerable to the big sharks. But it ended up working out for them, because with the Hoovers on their side, anyone would be a fool to mess with them. And with this protection, they had the luxury to focus on a record label called 4 Life Records. This was started by a Main Street baller named Liddell Rolls, also known as Del Dog, and rumors say that this guy had millions and millions of dollars. And with that money, he decided to sign Trey D, Goldie Loke, and Jewel. So Main Street started to look like they were making their way out of the street life and into the business world. However, in 2009, all of that would fall apart. August 14th, 2009, the Hoovers throw a party on this typical Friday night, and at the party, a Hoover and Main Street member get into an argument over a girl at the gathering. Apparently, she was dealing with both of them at the same time, and instead of confronting her, they confronted each other. Well, the argument turns bad and everyone leaves the party unhappy. And at this moment, things could go either way. They could have a meeting and clear the air, or they could let the tensions rise. Well, unfortunately, a Main Street member named Christopher Thomas let the tensions get to his head. 2 days later, August 16th, 2009. It's a Sunday in LA, and that means that people head to their local swap meets. And for the Hoovers, that's the Broadway swap meet on 87. Well, a Hoover named Daquan Allen just so happens to be at the mall. Now mind you, he is a Hoover, but not the set that has issues with Main Street, and on top of this, he wasn't even at the party. Regardless, Christopher Thomas notices his Astros hat and stops him in the mall. He yells, "Where you from?" And Daquan responds, "I'm a 9-4 Hoover." Then Christopher says that he's from Main Street. So being that historically they've had a great relationship, Daquan thinks that everything is good and goes in for a dap. But unfortunately, Christopher has different plans. Bang! this moment ruined all of the good relations between Main Street and Hoovers. Everything was instantly called off because of this erratic decision by Christopher, and this led to possibly the worst string of events in California history. Just 9 days later, the Hoovers would make a statement of their own. August 25th, 2009. A Hoover member drives down to 101st and Main Street, and there he sees a group of Main Street members on the corner. Bang! The next 2 months would be the worst 60-day stretch in South Central history. I kid you not, listen to this. South Central alone had 40 homicides in August and September 2009 alone. Yes, you heard that correctly. That's 40 in just 60 days. So with a population of 165,000 residents, that gives it a rate of 151 per 100,000. Now let me compare that to New York City's worst area. In 2009, the Bronx had a rate of 17 per 100,000. That means that South Central was nearly 10 times worse. And many of these incidents were attributed to the Hoovers versus everyone, and people from LA will vouch. But this next story doesn't take place in LA. Rather, we head up to Seattle, Washington. By 2012, West and South Seattle pretty much became mini South Central. So many LA families moved up there to escape the madness that the madness recreated itself. So in Seattle, you have many guys that still represent their LA affiliations, and that can lead to serious problems. February 21st, 2012. OG Peanut heads to a Mexican restaurant on Rainier Ave with his girlfriend, and while he's eating, a man named Lucky Dozier walks his way. This guy originally is a brim from LA, so he approaches Peanut, they start arguing and head to the parking lot. Both men go to their cars and return to the restaurant. Coincidentally, they both have the same idea. Bam bam. This incident is a big deal in Hoover history because Peanut was very respected from LA up to Seattle. And that finally takes us to the new era of Hoovers, which may be the wildest by far. These guys do not care, plain and simple. The old codes of conduct are completely gone and respect is far from being a factor in their lives. And the new era is represented by two rappers. The first is Jap5, and he represents 107 Hoover. He's obviously a big dude, but he does have a tongue ring and speaks very softly. However, that doesn't mean that he isn't with the activities. And next is Treyway, and he represents A-Tray Hoover. And this guy is not a fan of rappers coming to LA without checking in with the Hoovers. That's because when the Hoovers see rappers coming to town, they don't think to network or show love. Instead, they want to take what the rappers have. And that's what makes LA the most dangerous city for rappers. February 18th, 2020. New York rapper Pop Smoke comes to LA and rents out a mansion in the Hollywood Hills. During the day, he makes an Instagram post with the mansion in the background. Now, for the usual person, this seems normal, especially because he's only there for a couple of days. But unfortunately, the Hoovers see the post and search the internet all day to find out where the house could be located. 3:30 a.m. 4 A-Tray Hoovers head to the Hollywood mansion. They pull up to the house, see the fancy cars outside, and head for the windows. At 4 a.m., Pop Smoke and his crew hear some banging noises, so they call 911. However, this does them no good because of how long it can take. So the four Hoovers finally get inside, and that's when they run into Pop Smoke. Bang! The four Hoovers get away, and the next morning would bring some shocking news. The up-and-coming rapper had no reason for this to happen to him, and this is another reason why LA is the worst city for rappers. Well, after this, it would be 4 months before LAPD would find their guys. Corey Walker, Keandre Rogers, and 2 other members. One of the unidentified members happens to be the little brother of rapper Treyway. And if you don't believe me, he said it himself in a No Jumper interview with T-Rel. I really can't believe he actually allowed himself to say all that. But either way, the DA says that his little brother is the one responsible for Pop Smoke. However, under California law, his maximum sentence will be 9 years, so we will see how it plays out. So let me mention one last story. In my Baby Stone Gorilla video, I pretty much said that the Stink team wasn't active, but this here may lead you to a different conclusion. Let me introduce you to a 5-deuce Hoover named Dominique McGuire, also known as Big Gotti. He's a rapper, but he's more known for doing Hoover activities, and by that I mean that he has some sticky fingers. Well, for whatever reason, Draco's baby mom calls calls out Gotti on Instagram. And this made Gotti really upset, but instead of taking it to social media, he went looking for the Stink team members. And the next day, he caught one and ended up with their diamond watch and jewelry. So that's when Gotti went to Instagram and posted the jewelry. He then posted that Draco kept calling him. Well, that takes us to August 15th, 2022. Gotti is mysteriously found at 4 a.m. outside of a motel room in the Westlake area. So far, no one knows what happened, but Reddit is hyping up the Stink team. But either way, I hope this gave you guys a good idea of who the Hoovers are and why nobody should mess with them. And with that being said, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Peace!